In addition to the mountain pine beetle, there are several other bark beetles that affect conifers. Most of these are limiting their activity to natural areas, but some will move into urban settings as well and affect landscape plants. Probably the most important other bark beetle statewide in the forest would be the spruce beetle. This is an insect that's associated with Engelmann spruce. It's in the same genus as the mountain pine beetle, Dendroctonus, and it is capable of killing large numbers of trees during outbreak periods. There was a huge outbreak, probably bigger than what we just recently saw with the mountain pine beetle, of spruce beetle in western Colorado in the late 1940s, early 1950s, at the time the largest outbreak of any forest insect that had ever been recorded in North America. It's been lying low for many decades, although it has erupted in a couple little pockets over the last 5 or 6 years. Typical bark beetle is going to have eggs that are laid in a gallery produced by the mother underneath the bark. The eggs will hatch into larvae that will feed more or less perpendicular to the egg gallery produced by the mother. They will pupate at the end of the tunnels that they cut, and the damage by the larvae will be cutting across the phloem of the plant, and it will cut the movement of nutrients to the plant and the flow of water as well. So similar to the mountain pine beetle, spruce beetle can kill a tree usually within a year. And we have outbreaks of this. The outbreaks often are triggered by a special kind of event that rarely happens but can be spectacular when it does, and that's a wind throw event. So a wind throw event occurs usually at high elevations when winds of high velocity come from a direction that doesn't normally happen, and large numbers of trees may be blown over in a very short period of time. So a wind throw event in the Sangre de Cristo range, illustrated here, triggered an outbreak of spruce beetle in that part of the state. Several years prior to this, there was a wind throw event north of Steamboat Springs that triggered an outbreak that lasted for several years in that part of the state. The appearance of trees that are affected by spruce beetle is not quite as dramatic as you see with a tree that's affected by mountain pine beetle. You don't see the bright red response of the dying tree. It's more of a fading appearance, but the trees will die, and ultimately they'll drop the needles and be gray ghosts in the forest. The recent situation with spruce beetle is that there has been an uptick compared to previous decades. A little outbreak in that area north of Steamboat Springs has been the one that's been going on for the longest, but more recently and more extensively there's been a pocket down in southwest Colorado, particularly as you go over Wolf Creek Pass. Great number of trees have died in these isolated areas, but so far the outbreak has been fairly limited in terms of the area of the state that is experiencing serious spruce beetle outbreaks. The third member of that genus, Dendroctonus, is the Douglas fir beetle, Dendroctonus pseudotsugi. And as the name may indicate, this would be the bark beetle that you can see often on Douglas fir. This is one that is a little less aggressive. We rarely see outbreaks of this. Usually they follow episodes when the trees have been stressed, maybe by having the needles chewed off repeatedly by an insect known as the western spruce budworm. But it is another member of this genus, Dendroctonus. These are capable of killing living trees, and they develop within a tree that is alive and then kill it, unlike some of the other bark beetles we'll talk about that can do just fine in a dead or recently dead tree. Which brings us to Ips beetles. Ips beetles are members of a different genus, so they're in the genus Ips. They're not Dendroctonus something, they're Ips something, Ips pini, or some Ips species. These are much less aggressive in terms of their capacity to overcome tree defenses. So Ips beetles tend to track much more strongly with periods of extended drought. But they can be a problem under some circumstances and can kill trees. The Ips beetles are recognizable if you can look at them in cross-section by having the back wing cover being jagged. Now, if they're in the genus Dendroctonus, such as the mountain pine beetle, Douglas fir beetle, spruce beetle, the hind wing cover is rounded, as are some other bark beetles. But with Ips, it's quite jagged. So the jagged wing covers at the end of the body are going to be a good way to tell this group of pine infesting and spruce infesting bark beetles. The kinds of trees that Ips beetles attack are ones that are under some stress. So the entry points they make are associated with sawdust rather than a lot of gum. The trees are often fairly depleted in their ability to gum out and produce a pitch-out response if Ips are able to attack it. Again, a very healthy tree they're not able to overcome, but ones that are under stress and cannot effectively mount a good defense can be quite susceptible to Ips. Then again, you're not going to see pitch tubes. You're going to see more sawdust, and these can occur on trees that are felled. These are insects that can develop in a recently killed or even dead log that is lying on the ground, unlike mountain pine beetle, which requires a living host for it to successfully reproduce. If you look under the bark, the tunnels that are made by Ips beetles are in a different pattern. Instead of having a female go in and make a gallery underneath the bark, the male goes in and he'll make a little central gallery. And indicated here, that little center area, sometimes called the nuptial chamber, because the male will then produce a pheromone to attract females, and if successful, females will come in, mate with the male, and then each of them will go off on their own to make their own egg gallery. So you have a central nuptial gallery of some kind, and then radiating egg galleries produced by the females. And sometimes these can be pretty spectacular and pretty dramatic. Sometimes they're less obvious, but we can see some in these pictures here. The larvae again moving across the grain, more or less perpendicular to where the egg gallery had been produced. Lots of little galleries right here. Now, Ips beetles, unlike mountain pine beetle, may just take out a limb. They may take out the top of a tree, they may take out an overshaded limb or a limb that's been damaged in some way. So, unlike the Dendroctonus, which almost always, if they successfully attack a tree, will kill a tree, the bark beetles in the genus Ips may sometimes limit their attacks to part of the tree, and the tree then will survive in the unaffected portion. So the top of the tree, or a limited branch, or a series of branches may be all that gets affected by these. One Ips beetle that erupted in the urban corridor in the Front Range part of Colorado several years ago was spruce Ips, not to be confused with the spruce beetle. This is in the Ips genus, Ips hunteri, an insect that normally is limited to just isolated limb that's been overshaded or damaged and not causing any serious harm. It did erupt during a period in the early 2000s, and it occurred in these outbreak numbers because that was a serious period of drought. And that's what we see with many of these Ips beetles, that they will erupt sometimes pretty rapidly if trees are under an extended period of drought. The galleries produced by the spruce Ips underneath the bark might not be the typical pattern that I just discussed, where you have a strong central nuptial gallery. They may be a little more diffuse, as is indicated in the picture here, more like a mountain pine beetle. And the reason that you have Ips beetles taking off during periods of drought is that the trees can't respond sufficiently to resist these attacks. The pitch-out response, which is the primary way trees do fend off invading insects, can usually deter Ips beetles at a far higher level than they can a mountain pine beetle during an outbreak. So the basic situation when we have these is a period of drought, Ips beetles build up, rainfall returns, Ips beetles go away. That being said, there are some spectacular outbreaks, and probably the worst have been in pinyon. Again, associated with droughty conditions, wide areas on western Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico saw extensive death of pinyon during the most recent pinyon ips outbreak. Again, these were related to hot, dry conditions that extended over several years when the pinyon ips built up enough to overcome the tree defenses that normally were holding them off. Again, with the return of adequate rain, the outbreaks returned to a more normal level, and tree losses have been greatly reduced in recent years. But again, ips beetles track with drought. So again, another picture of some spectacular losses of pinyon that we saw last time this was a problem in outbreak numbers. Management of ips beetles can be important if you have conditions where the trees are stressed, if there's high numbers of ips beetles around, or recently transplanted pines or other conifers can be susceptible to ips because they're not well established. So how do we manage ips? One of the most important things would be to make sure it is growing as well as it can, and that does include adequate watering. A tree that's in an irrigated landscape will almost never be affected by ips beetles in a way that may threaten the survival of the tree. So give it a little extra water if you can. Again, no water, no pitch out. If you do have adequate water, the tree can respond. Sanitation to reduce breeding material can help. During outbreak periods, there is some tree removal of affected trees so that beetles emerging from the infested trees will not then move to other trees. However, sanitation also involves getting rid of material that might be otherwise neglected, perhaps slash material. Slash that is produced in the course of, say, silvicultural practices to thin a stand can be an excellent source for breeding of ips beetles. Not mountain pine beetle, but ips beetles. They could build up in very large numbers in slash piles and then overcome nearby trees. So you don't want to have a lot of fresh cut debris around in plantings where ips might be a concern. So you do have to remove them or dispose of them or burn them. Preventive sprays, same thing with any bark beetle. The timing is to get a preventive insecticide on the trunk prior to periods when ips beetles are flying and trying to enter the trees. Now, it becomes more difficult with ips than with the other kinds of bark beetles we've talked about because ips have multiple generations, maybe even 3 generations a year. And the first one may be flying in March. So these have to be applied very early in the year, and in outbreak periods may even require a second application. Although usually most of the insecticides applied for bark beetles will give you season-long control. They will last that long. But the timing's a little different. These are a little less aggressive, quite a bit less aggressive than a mountain pine beetle or spruce beetle. On the other hand, control is a little bit different timing and a little bit different approach.